The cruelest thing about losing a job is not the paycheck, Ethan Walker would later say. It is how fast the world expects you to pretend you are still standing. At 8:30 that morning, he was called into a glass conference room on the 12th floor of Hayes Meridian and thanked for 9 years of loyalty in under 4 minutes. By 8:40, his security badge had been deactivated. By 8:50, he was carrying a cardboard box through the lobby with a framed crayon drawing from his daughter, a half-dead desk plant, and the kind of silence that only comes when a man realizes he has just been erased by people who still expect him to smile on the way out. Snow was falling over downtown Denver in thin gray sheets, turning the sidewalks slick and the traffic lights blurry. Ethan stood beside his old pickup in the parking garage for a long moment, staring at the box on the passenger seat like it belonged to someone else. Inside it was nearly a decade of small things that had once made him feel necessary. A coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Dad," a flashlight, a wrench with his initials scratched into the handle, a Christmas card signed by coworkers who probably had no idea he was already gone. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. "Lucy." He answered on the second ring and forced his voice into something warm before she could hear the crack in it. "Hey, Peanut." Her little voice came through bright and breathless, talking about a spelling test, a class pet, and whether he was still coming to her winter music night on Friday. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned one forearm against the truck. "Would not miss it for the world," he said. It was not a lie. It was just one more promise he had no idea how he was going to keep. By noon, he had already called 3 contractors, 2 building managers, and a friend who sometimes threw him overnight delivery shifts when money got tight. By 2, the school nurse had left a voicemail about Lucy's inhaler running low. By 4, he was sitting in a pharmacy parking lot doing math on the back of an old gas receipt, trying to figure out whether rent, medication, and groceries could all fit inside the same impossible week. The answer was no. The answer was never going to be no in front of Lucy, but it was no all the same. So by 10:30 that night, while most of Denver was hiding from the storm, Ethan was driving a borrowed delivery route through the foothills with cold coffee in the cup holder and a paper bag of untouched fries on the seat beside him. The roads were slick with fresh snow, the kind that made the world look clean while quietly trying to slide your tires into a ditch. He had one more drop before heading home. One more tip if he was lucky. One more hour before he had to walk through his front door and act like tomorrow was still under control. Then, halfway down a dark stretch of county road outside Cedar Glen, his headlights caught the shape of a black sedan sitting crooked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. A woman stood beside it in a long coat, one hand wrapped around her arms against the cold, the other waving at the first set of headlights that had not passed her by. Ethan's foot eased off the gas before his brain had time to argue with his bank account. He could have kept driving. God knew the day had earned him that right. But there are men who measure their lives by what they have left, and then there are men who still stop for a stranger when they have almost nothing left at all. Ethan pulled his truck onto the shoulder, reached for the flashlight in his old work bag, and stepped out into the snow, not knowing that the woman shivering beside that dead car was the same CEO whose signature had ended his career 12 hours earlier. Ethan lowered the flashlight beam so it would not hit the woman directly in the face. Up close, she looked less like someone stranded on a snowy county road and more like someone who had never expected to be anywhere near one. Her coat was expensive, camel-colored wool already dusted white at the shoulders, and her heeled boots were sinking into the slush one careful inch at a time. Blonde hair clung damply to her cheek where the wind had torn it loose, and even in the weak pulse of the hazard lights he could see that she was shivering hard enough to lose the fight with pride. "You all right?" he asked. It was a simple question, but there was no such thing as a simple answer at 11 o'clock on a road this empty. The woman looked at him with the kind of hesitation people wear when they are deciding whether help is safer than being alone. "My car died about 20 minutes ago," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "My phone is at 1%, and I think I lost service 3 miles back." Ethan glanced at the sedan, then at the dark road stretching behind her in both directions. No streetlights. No gas station for miles. Snow still coming down in a fine, relentless curtain. "Pop the hood," he said. "Get in the truck and warm up while I take a look." She opened her mouth like she might argue, then stopped when a gust of wind hit them both hard enough to make her shoulders fold in. Ethan handed her the flashlight instead and walked to the front of the car, breath curling white in the dark. The engine gave him the answer in less than a minute. Dead battery, maybe worse. The terminals were crusted with corrosion, and one of the belts looked old enough to vote. He shut the hood gently and turned back toward the truck. Through the windshield, he could see the woman sitting stiffly in the passenger seat, hands cupped around the heater vent like she still did not trust herself to thaw. Ethan climbed in, bringing cold air and snow with him. "Bad news," he said, brushing flakes from his jacket. "This is not a roadside fix." She let out a breath that sounded too close to breaking. Then she looked down, almost embarrassed by it, and Ethan caught the first real crack in the polished mask she had been trying to hold together. "I cannot stay out here," she admitted quietly. "I know." He looked at the dashboard clock, then at the paper bag of fries on the seat between them, then back at the storm pressing against the windshield. He had exactly $18 in his checking account, a delivery route still unfinished, and a daughter asleep at home with an inhaler that needed refilling by Friday. Any sensible man would have called roadside assistance, wished the stranger luck, and driven away before his own life sank any further. But Ethan had never confused sensible with decent. "There is a diner about 10 minutes from here," he said. "Open all night. Warm coffee, bad pie, working phone if the lines are not down. I can drop you there and come back for your car when the weather breaks." The woman stared at him as if kindness had become a language she no longer heard often enough to trust on the first try. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Ethan gave a tired shrug and reached for the gear shift. "Because it is 11 at night. You are freezing, and my mother would come back from heaven to haunt me if I left you on the side of this road." For the first time, something in her expression softened. Not a smile exactly, more like the memory of one. She nodded once and folded her hands in her lap as Ethan pulled the truck back onto the road, neither of them knowing that the heater humming between them was carrying two people who had already changed each other's lives before either one understood why. The diner sat at the edge of Cedar Glen like it had been there longer than the road itself. All fogged windows, humming neon, and a hand-painted sign that promised hot coffee and home PIE in letters faded by 20 winters. Ethan parked his truck beneath the buzzing light over the entrance and cut the engine. For a second, neither of them moved. Snow tapped softly against the windshield, and the heater exhaled one last tired breath before the cab began to cool. The woman folded her hands tighter in her lap, as if she had suddenly remembered she was in a stranger's truck in the middle of nowhere and had no good explanation for how her night had unraveled this far. Ethan reached into the back seat, grabbed the thick plaid blanket he kept for Lucy, and held it out to her without ceremony. "Take it," he said when she hesitated. "The diner heat works about as well as Congress." That earned him the smallest laugh, quick and surprised, and it changed her face more than the dashboard light had. She looked younger with that sound in her, less polished, less armored. "Thank you," she said, taking the blanket and wrapping it over her coat. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, bacon grease, and the kind of pie crust that came from muscle memory instead of recipes. A tired country song played low from an old speaker near the kitchen pass-through, and only 3 booths were occupied at that hour. A trucker stirring cream into his coffee, a young couple whispering over fries, and an elderly man reading a newspaper like midnight was still the middle of his day. Ethan guided the woman into the far booth beneath the window, the one farthest from the draft. "Sit," he said. "I will get the coffee before Dolores decides we are both suspicious." Sure enough, the waitress behind the counter had already narrowed her eyes at them with the practical caution of someone who had seen every kind of bad decision after dark. "You adopting strays now, Ethan?" she called as he approached. "Only the freezing ones," he answered. Dolores snorted and poured 2 coffees without asking. Ethan added a bowl of chicken soup and a grilled cheese to the order before checking the total on the register screen and feeling his stomach tighten. He had enough if he skipped breakfast tomorrow. Maybe lunch too. He paid anyway. When he slid back into the booth, the woman looked at the soup, then at him. "You did not have to do that." Ethan shrugged, stirring cream into his coffee he did not really want. "You look like you have not eaten since lunch." She stared at the steam rising from the bowl as if it were something far more dangerous than kindness. "I have not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside pressed white against the glass. Somewhere in the kitchen a dish clattered, and the old heater rattled like it was trying to stay awake. Then the woman finally lifted her spoon and took a bite, and Ethan saw the exact second warmth reached a place in her that had been cold for longer than one snowy night. "What is your name?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down at the cracked vinyl tabletop before answering. "Ethan." He left it there on purpose, just one name, nothing more. She nodded as if she understood the boundary and offered one of her own. "Charlotte," she said. The name settled between them like a match dropped near dry timber. But Ethan did not know that yet. He only knew he was tired, broke, and sitting across from a stranger with expensive shoes and sad eyes who looked like she had spent her whole life in warm rooms and still somehow ended up freezing beside him. Charlotte held the soup bowl with both hands for a moment before taking another bite, as if the warmth itself needed permission to reach her. Up close, Ethan could see the polish beginning to slip in small, human ways. Her mascara had smudged faintly at one corner. A loose strand of blonde hair kept falling across her cheek, and each time she tucked it back, the movement looked less like vanity and more like fatigue. She had the kind of face people trusted in magazine profiles and boardrooms, the kind built for confidence and camera angles. But tonight, it was carrying something heavier than inconvenience. "You live around here?" she asked after a while. Ethan tore a paper sleeve from his straw and rolled it into a tight little spiral without thinking. "Cedar Ridge," he said. "About 20 minutes east if the roads are decent. Tonight they are not." Charlotte glanced toward the window where snow was still piling against the glass in soft white streaks. "And you were out this late because of work?" It was a reasonable question. Ethan gave a short laugh that held no humor at all. Something like that. He should have left it there. Most nights he would have. But there was something strange about sitting in a nearly empty diner at midnight with a woman who did not know him, a woman he would probably never see again, a woman too exhausted to perform whatever version of herself the world usually got. Maybe that was why the truth came out quieter than he intended. "I got laid off this morning," he said, eyes still on the coffee in front of him. "Needed the extra cash, so I picked up a delivery route from a buddy." Charlotte's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. It was a tiny pause, less than a second, but Ethan noticed it because the rest of her had been trying so hard not to react to anything. "I am sorry," she said. The words were simple, practiced almost, but there was a softness under them that did not sound fake. Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, me too." He reached for his phone then, saw the time, and frowned. 11:52. Lucy would be asleep by now, but he knew better than to trust that on a night when her inhaler had been low and her father had not been home to tuck her in. He tapped her babysitter's number and waited. Charlotte looked down at her soup while he listened to the line ring. On the third try, a sleepy voice answered. "She okay?" Ethan asked before anything else. Relief loosened his shoulders when he heard the answer. Lucy was asleep. She had coughed a little around 9, then settled. Her backpack was packed for school. Her shoes were by the door. Ethan thanked the sitter twice and hung up with the kind of quiet care only single parents understand. Charlotte watched him tuck the phone away, and something in her expression changed. Not pity, not curiosity. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of someone seeing the architecture of another person's life in one ordinary phone call. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. 8, Ethan said, and this time his whole face softened around the number. "Lucy." Charlotte smiled faintly into her coffee. "You said her name like a prayer." Ethan looked out at the storm and let the corner of his mouth lift. "Some days that is exactly what she is." Charlotte lowered her eyes, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked less like a stranger passing through his night and more like a woman standing just outside the warmth of a life she had never quite learned how to build for herself. Then her phone, forgotten on the table beside the salt shaker, buzzed once with enough force to make them both look down at the screen. And in the glow of that light, the first crack in the night finally opened. The phone screen lit Charlotte's face from below, and in that pale rectangle of light, Ethan saw the entire night rearrange itself. Her lock screen was clean and expensive, a monochrome skyline behind a flood of notifications, but it was the name at the top that reached across the table and closed around his throat. Mason Reed, Chief of Staff. Beneath it, a preview of the message glowed in sharp, white letters. "The board wants a statement by morning. They are asking whether the Hayes Meridian layoffs were your call or your father's plan." Ethan did not mean to read it. He only glanced down because the phone had buzzed between the sugar caddy and the salt shaker. But once he saw the company name, the rest of the room seemed to fall 2 degrees colder. Hayes Meridian. The words sat there on the screen with the same clinical precision they had carried on the folder slid across a conference table that morning. Charlotte must have realized what he was looking at in the exact same second, because she snatched the phone off the table so fast her coffee sloshed over the rim. The silence that followed was not loud. It was worse. It was careful. Ethan leaned back against the cracked vinyl booth and stared at her as the pieces locked into place one by one. The coat, the polished voice, the exhaustion wrapped in expensive fabric, the way the waitress had looked at Charlotte like she did not belong under fluorescent diner lights. "Hayes Meridian," he said at last, not because he needed confirmation, but because his own voice sounded strange in his ears, and he needed to hear it anyway. Charlotte did not answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the phone until her knuckles blanched. "Ethan," she began, and it was the first time she had said his name like it might break something. He gave a short, humorless laugh and looked down at the untouched fries cooling in their paper bag. "No," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "You have got to be kidding me." Charlotte's face changed then, not into defensiveness, not yet, but into the unmistakable expression of someone realizing the universe has just placed her on the wrong side of a story she does not know how to survive. "I did not know," she said. "I swear to you, I did not know who you were." Ethan lifted his eyes to hers, and there was no anger in them at first. That was what made it hurt. There was only fatigue. Bone-deep, soul-level fatigue from a man who had spent all day being told his life could be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet and had still stopped to help a stranger in the snow because decency was easier for him then. Bitterness. "You fired me this morning," he said quietly, "and I bought you soup tonight." The sentence landed between them like a dropped plate. Charlotte looked as if she wanted to argue with one half of it and apologize for the other half, but neither side of her knew where to begin. "I signed off on a restructuring package," she said, too quickly, as if precision might save her. "I did not know your name was on it." Ethan's mouth tightened, and for the first time that night, he looked exactly like a man who had been standing all day with a fracture no one else could see. "That is supposed to help?" he asked. Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it again. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the windows, and the old neon sign buzzed over the parking lot like it was trying to hum them back into simpler lives. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face and stared down at the coffee that had gone cold between them. He was not shouting. He was not making a scene. Somehow that made the moment feel even smaller and more devastating. "Do you know what I did after I left your building this morning?" he asked. Charlotte shook her head. "I called my daughter's school nurse to ask how long an inhaler refill can wait before it stops being responsible and starts being reckless." He said it in the same tone another man might use to discuss the weather. "Then I drove around looking for overnight work because rent still comes whether a CEO knows your name or not." Charlotte flinched like the truth had physical weight. Ethan saw it and looked away, suddenly too tired to watch someone else discover the cost of her own decisions. "I am sorry," she whispered. It was not a polished corporate apology. It was worse than that. It sounded real. Ethan let the silence sit there for a long moment, the kind of silence that asks a person whether remorse means anything after the damage is already done. Then he reached for his wallet, set a few wrinkled bills beneath the coffee mugs, and stood up from the booth. "Finish your soup," he said, voice flat with exhaustion rather than cruelty. "I will still get you somewhere safe. But after that, Charlotte, I think you should call someone whose name you actually know." Charlotte did not touch the soup again. She sat in the booth with both hands around her coffee cup, though the drink had already gone lukewarm, and watched Ethan stand at the counter near the pay phone with the tired posture of a man who had spent too much of his life carrying news he did not deserve. Dolores was wiping down menus with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone pretending not to listen while hearing every word in the room. Ethan fed quarters into the wall phone and called the towing service first, then a 24-hour garage in Cedar Glen, then finally a local motel that still had one room left and did not ask too many questions about late arrivals and snowstorms. He handled it all with the same steady tone he had used to order Charlotte's soup, as if arranging shelter for the woman who had helped dismantle his life was simply one more chore the night had placed on his list. When he returned to the booth, he set a paper receipt beside her napkin. "Tow truck will get your car at first light," he said. "Garage opens at 7. There is a motel 2 blocks over with one room left. I already paid for it." Charlotte looked up so fast, it was almost a recoil. "You did what?" Ethan slid his wallet back into his jacket pocket and reached for the truck keys on the table. It is one night. Do not make it a thing. Her face flushed, not with anger, but with something closer to shame. Ethan, no. I can pay for my own room. I know you can. His voice stayed calm, but there was a weight under it now, the kind that made every word land harder than volume ever could. That is not why I did it. Charlotte stared at him as if kindness had become unbearable in a way cruelty never was. Then why? Ethan looked out the diner window at the snow still falling under the parking lot lights, white and relentless and indifferent to who deserved what. When he answered, his tone was almost gentle. Because leaving you alone in a dead car would have been wrong before I knew who you were, and it is still wrong now. The sentence stripped the room bare. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the receipt, blinking too slowly, as though she were trying to keep something private from slipping into view. I do not know what to do with that, she admitted. Ethan gave a tired breath that was not quite a laugh. You do not have to do anything tonight. He stood, then hesitated just long enough to add the one thing he had not meant to say out loud. But tomorrow, when the snow is gone and your board is asking for statements and your assistants are lining up excuses, maybe remember that there is a difference between cutting costs and cutting through people. Charlotte looked at him then, really looked at him, and whatever she saw on his face made her sit a little straighter, like someone being handed a truth too heavy to put down. Were you always this good at making people feel small without raising your voice? She asked, the corner of her mouth threatening something fragile and sad. Ethan picked up the paper bag of fries he had never eaten and shrugged into his jacket. No, he said. Mostly I am just tired. For the first time since the reveal, Charlotte let out a quiet laugh, and it broke halfway through under the weight of the night. Ethan held the diner door open for her a few minutes later, the bell above it jangling against the cold. The walk to the motel was only 2 blocks, but the snow had deepened, and Charlotte nearly slipped once on the icy sidewalk before Ethan steadied her by the elbow and stepped back again, as if even basic kindness needed boundaries now. The motel lobby smelled like old carpet and coffee grounds. The clerk handed over a brass key attached to a plastic room number and gave them the kind of sleepy glance that comes from years of seeing lives intersect at strange hours. Upstairs, outside room 12, Charlotte stopped with the key in one hand and the plaid blanket still draped around her shoulders. Ethan. He turned back. Her expression had lost all traces of executive polish. She looked younger in the dim hallway light, and far more honest. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, she said softly. I do not think I deserve that. But I need you to know I am going to look into what happened. Not because I am embarrassed. Because I think I have been running a company from so far above the ground that I forgot what people look like for my level. Ethan stood there in the flicker of a motel hallway light, snow melting off his boots, exhaustion pulling at every line of his face. That would be a good place to start, he said. Then he gave her the smallest nod, turned, and walked back out into the storm, leaving Charlotte alone with a room key, a paper receipt, and the first honest reckoning of her adult life. Charlotte Hayes did not sleep. By 6:30 the next morning, she was sitting upright on the motel bed in yesterday's coat, laptop open, hair pulled back, the untouched Bible from the nightstand serving as a coaster for coffee she had already reheated twice. Snow still clung to the motel railing outside, but the storm had loosened its grip, and with daylight came the kind of clarity that feels less like peace and more like judgment. Ethan's words had followed her into every restless hour of the night. There is a difference between cutting costs and cutting through people. She had spent years being praised for decisiveness, for clean strategy, for making hard calls without flinching. No one had ever bothered to tell her that a decision could be efficient on paper and still cruel in a kitchen where a child needed medicine. So Charlotte did the one thing her executive team had probably never expected from her after a layoff. She started reading names. Not headcount reports. Not payroll summaries. Names. Ethan Walker's personnel file opened first, and what she found there made her sit back in silence. 9 years with Hayes Meridian. Not a single disciplinary mark. 3 separate commendations for solving facility failures that had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Emergency weekend call-ins. Holiday coverage. Notes from department managers who described him with words executives rarely noticed because they did not fit on a quarterly slide. Steady, trusted, unselfish, the one people call when everything breaks. Charlotte kept reading. He had turned down a promotion 2 years earlier because the longer commute would have kept him away from his daughter's asthma appointments. He had donated and used vacation hours to a coworker whose husband was dying. He had trained younger hires without being asked and stayed late to repair a heating failure in one of the company's older buildings during a January freeze because a daycare tenant was still inside. By the time Mason Reed knocked on her motel door at 8, Charlotte was staring at the screen as if it had become a witness against her. "You look awful," Mason said, stepping inside with a leather folio tucked under one arm. "The board call is in 40 minutes, and your father wants to know if you are prepared to defend the restructuring." Charlotte did not look up. "Who selected Ethan Walker for termination?" Mason blinked. "What?" "The maintenance supervisor with 9 years in facilities. Single father. Cedar Ridge District." "Who put his name on the list?" Mason shifted, suddenly cautious. "The regional cuts were modeled by finance and approved through operations. We all signed off." Charlotte closed the laptop halfway, not in anger, but in disappointment, so cold it made the room feel smaller. "That is not what I asked." Mason studied her face and understood, too late, that something had changed overnight in a motel room no board member would ever hear about. "The recommendation came from Nolan Pierce," he said finally. "Facilities director." He flagged Ethan as non-essential after outsourcing proposals came in. Charlotte went still. Nolan Pierce had been one of the loudest voices in the restructuring meetings, always talking about efficiency, redundancy, optimization, as if human beings were extension cords you could unplug without consequence. "Get me every performance review Nolan ever filed on Ethan," she said, "and every service ticket Ethan closed in the last 3 years. Mason stared. "Charlotte, with respect, we have a company-wide press issue, investor concerns, and a board that thinks you are already too emotional about this process." Charlotte stood then, slow and composed and more dangerous in her calm than she had ever been in anger. "Good," she said, "because if my company has been using the word restructure to hide lazy cruelty, I would like to become much more emotional about it." Mason opened his mouth, then thought better of it. After he left, Charlotte sat back down, reopened Ethan's file, and found herself staring at the emergency contact section where Lucy Walker's name sat beneath his own in careful black text. 8 years old. Asthma. Primary parent. Father only. Charlotte touched the edge of the screen with one finger, not because it changed anything, but because sometimes guilt makes people reach for the nearest proof that the damage was real. Then she looked out through the motel window at the snow beginning to melt off the parking lot, and made a decision that had nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with the man who had bought her soup with money he could not spare. She was going to Cedar Ridge, not as a CEO arriving to tidy up a mistake, but as a woman who had finally understood that the worst thing about power is how easy it makes it to forget the people standing underneath it. Charlotte found Ethan 2 days later in the last place a CEO from Denver should have looked comfortable and the only place that made sense once she understood him. It was the elementary school auditorium in Cedar Ridge, a squat brick building with snow piled along the sidewalks and paper snowflakes taped crookedly across the glass doors. Inside, folding chairs had been lined up in uneven rows beneath a stage dressed with painted cardboard stars and a banner that read Winter Music Night in glitter that had begun to peel at the corners. Children in sweaters and angel wings whispered backstage while parents stamped slush from their boots and balanced paper cups of weak coffee in their hands. Ethan was seated in the third row wearing his one good flannel beneath a clean work jacket, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the stage with the alert devotion of a father who had not slept enough but would still cross a blizzard for 8 minutes of his daughter singing off-key. He saw Charlotte before she reached him. The recognition in his face was immediate, but not warm. Not cold either. Just guarded, like a man who had already spent too much energy surviving one surprise from her and was not interested in a second. Charlotte stopped. Beside the empty chair at the end of his row, clutching a slim folder in one hand and Lucy's inhaler refill bag in the other. "I know this is not a good time," she said quietly. "Then why are you here?" Ethan's voice stayed low for the sake of the room, but there was no softness in it. On stage, a teacher adjusted a microphone while a kindergartner waved at someone in the front row. Charlotte looked down at the paper bag in her hand before answering. "Because your daughter needed this by Friday," she said, holding up the inhaler refill. And because if I waited until Monday, I would spend the weekend sounding like every other person with power who apologizes only after it is convenient. Ethan stared at the bag for a long moment, then took it from her without touching her hand. How did you know? It was in your employee emergency notes, Charlotte said. I should not have learned something that personal by reading a file after I had already signed a decision that put her medication at risk. Ethan looked away toward the stage, jaw tightening once. Lucy was peeking through the curtain in a silver headband, searching the crowd for her father. The moment she spotted him, her whole face lit up. Ethan lifted a hand and smiled back on instinct, and Charlotte saw it again. That transformation she could not stop thinking about, the way exhaustion left his face whenever his daughter entered the frame. I did not come with a check, Charlotte said carefully. I did not come to buy forgiveness or to hand you your old job back like that fixes what happened. I came because I spent the last 48 hours learning exactly how much of my company was being run by people who use efficiency to hide cowardice, and I fired Nolan Pierce this morning. Ethan turned to her so sharply that the chair beneath him creaked. You what? I also reversed every termination he pushed through without proper review, including yours, Charlotte said. But that is not the real reason I am here. She opened the slim folder and set it gently on the empty seat between them. Hayes Meridian is launching a regional facilities integrity program after what I found. It needs someone who understands buildings, people, emergency systems, and the difference between a budget line and a human cost. I want you to run it. New title, better pay, full benefits, complete authority over the field teams. And if your answer is no, I will still deserve it. Ethan did not touch the folder. The children on stage had begun to sing, thin voices wobbling through silent night, while parents lifted phones to record. For a few seconds he said nothing at all. Then Lucy stepped to the front row of second graders, spotted him again, and sang her first line with such fierce concentration that Ethan's eyes softened despite himself. You picked a strange place to change someone's life, he murmured. Charlotte followed his gaze to Lucy and let out the smallest breath. No, she said. I picked the place that reminded me what your life actually is. That landed somewhere deeper than the offer itself. Ethan looked at the folder, then at the inhaler bag in his hand, then back at the stage where his daughter was singing beneath cardboard stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only Charlotte could hear it. If I take that job, it will not be because you feel guilty. Charlotte nodded. I know. And if I work for your company again, no one gets to treat me like I should be grateful for surviving a mistake they made. I know that too. Ethan held her gaze for one long second, measuring whether she meant it, whether power had finally come close enough to humility to be trusted. Then Lucy missed a note so badly that the mother in front of them had to cover a laugh, and Ethan's mouth betrayed him with a tired, helpless smile. Charlotte smiled too, not at the mistake, but at the sound of joy returning to a room where fear had lived for too long. I will read it, Ethan said at last, tapping the folder once. That is all I can promise today. Charlotte looked like someone who had expected less and hoped for more anyway. Then that is enough for today. And as the children's voices rose under the warm gymnasium lights, with Lucy singing her heart out and Ethan holding the medicine that meant she would breathe easier tonight, Charlotte sat quietly in the chair beside him and understood that redemption did not begin in boardrooms or press releases. It began in small rooms where people had every right to shut the door and chose, with trembling caution, to leave it open just a little longer. 2 weeks later, the snow outside Ethan Walker's kitchen window had softened into slow, bright flurries that melted against the glass and slid down in crooked silver lines. The house was warm in the uneven, hard-working way small houses often are, with a pot of chili on the stove, Lucy's crayons scattered across the table, and a strand of white Christmas lights still hanging over the sink because Ethan had not gotten around to taking them down, and Lucy liked the way they made the room look magical after dark. Charlotte Hayes sat at that same kitchen table in a plain cream sweater instead of a tailored coat, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, the other resting beside a stack of revised program proposals with Ethan's notes written across the margins in dark blue ink. Nothing about the room looked like the world she came from. The chairs did not match. The floor creaked near the pantry. The refrigerator was covered in spelling tests, grocery lists, and a school photo of Lucy grinning with one front tooth missing. And yet Charlotte had never felt more aware of what mattered inside a life than she did sitting there, while Ethan stood at the stove tasting the chili, and Lucy hummed over a coloring book at his elbow. He had accepted the new role 3 days earlier, but only after rewriting half the job description himself. He had crossed out corporate phrases like asset optimization and inserted words Charlotte suspected no consultant in Denver had ever dared to prioritize in an operations document: safety, trust, response time, family impact, field respect. He had not come back to Hayes Meridian as a man asking to be restored. He had come back as a man finally unwilling to let anyone confuse his humility for permission to be used. Charlotte respected him more for that than she knew how to say. "You are burning the cornbread," Lucy announced from the table with the cheerful authority only 8-year-olds can carry. Ethan looked over his shoulder, feigned offense, and opened the oven with a dish towel. "It is called extra color," he said. "That is how serious chefs do it." Lucy wrinkled her nose. "Serious chefs do not set off the smoke detector." Charlotte laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound turned Ethan toward her with a smile that still surprised her every time it arrived. It was not flashy or practiced. It was the smile of a man who had spent so long carrying responsibility that joy looked almost shy on him when it finally surfaced. "See," Lucy said, pointing her crayon at Charlotte like she had just won a case in court. "She knows." Ethan shook his head and set the cornbread on the counter. "I am being outnumbered in my own kitchen." "You are being corrected in your own kitchen," Charlotte said, and the ease in her voice startled them both for half a second before it settled into something warm. That was how it had been growing between them in the days after the school concert and the job offer. Not dramatic, not rushed, just a series of small mercies. Charlotte had driven out to Cedar Ridge twice that week, once to walk Ethan through the revised program budget, and once because Lucy had insisted Charlotte needed to see the school's paper snowflake display before it came down. Ethan had remained careful with her, kind but measured, as though trust were a door he was willing to unlock only 1 inch at a time. Charlotte did not blame him. If anything, she trusted him more because he refused to pretend pain disappeared simply because someone powerful had apologized for causing it. Lucy hopped down from her chair and carried 3 mismatched bowls to the table while Ethan ladled chili into each one. The room filled with the smell of cumin, tomatoes, and cornbread that was only slightly too dark to defend honestly. Charlotte watched him move through the kitchen, passing napkins to Lucy, checking the inhaler on the counter by habit, reaching automatically to steady a chair before she sat. There was no performance in him, no attempt to seem noble. That was what kept undoing her. Ethan had every reason to become bitter after the way the world had handled him, and yet his first instinct was still to make sure everyone else had enough. Lucy blew on her spoon, then looked up with sudden seriousness. "Dad says you are fixing the company so people do not get treated bad anymore." Ethan nearly choked on his first bite. "Lucy, what?" she asked wide-eyed. "That is what you said in the truck." Charlotte looked at Ethan over the steam rising from her bowl. His ears had gone faintly red, and for the first time in her life, the woman who could hold her own against investors and board members felt something soft and unguarded open in her chest. "Your dad is helping me fix it," she said gently. Lucy considered that, then nodded as if accepting a business arrangement on behalf of the entire adult world. "Good," she said, "because he is really smart, but he forgets that when he is worried." Ethan stared at his daughter in mock betrayal. "You are not supposed to tell people my secrets." Lucy grinned and reached for the cornbread. Charlotte smiled into her coffee, but behind the smile was a truth she had been carrying quietly ever since that night in the diner. Ethan had not just changed her opinion of one layoff. He had changed the scale by which she measured success, leadership, and strength itself. She had spent years learning how to command rooms. Ethan had taught her, without trying, how to deserve one. Later, after dinner, Lucy fell asleep on the couch under the old plaid blanket while a cartoon played low on the television. Ethan tucked the blanket under her chin, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and stood there a second longer than necessary, just watching her breathe. Charlotte waited in the doorway to the living room, coat over one arm, car keys in hand, not wanting to interrupt the sacred, ordinary quiet of it. When Ethan finally turned back to her, the house had gone almost completely still. Snow tapped softly at the windows. The Christmas lights over the sink cast a low gold reflection down the hallway. "You do not have to keep driving out here for meetings," Ethan said, though there was no real resistance left in the words. Charlotte tilted her head. "What if I tell you the meetings are no longer the only reason?" Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorway, tired and thoughtful and more honest than he knew. "Then I would probably tell you Cedar Ridge is a long drive just to eat burned cornbread." Charlotte stepped closer, close enough to lower her voice without lowering her eyes. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe some things are worth the drive once you finally know what matters." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and in that silence there was no boardroom, no layoff list, no snowbound roadside, no power imbalance left sharp enough to wound them. There was only a small kitchen, a sleeping child, and two adults standing in the kind of peace neither of them had expected to find inside the wreckage of a bad day. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his face easing into something almost like wonder. "You know," he said, "for someone who runs a company, you are getting dangerously good at sounding like a person." Charlotte laughed under her breath, and this time when he smiled back, there was nothing guarded in it at all. He opened the front door for her, the cold night air curling in around his boots, and Charlotte stepped onto the porch with snow catching in her hair and gratitude catching somewhere deeper. At the top step, she turned back. Ethan was still standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the warm light behind him and the quiet life he had fought so hard to protect stretching out just over his shoulder. It would have been easy to call him heroic for what he had done. Easier still to call what happened between them a miracle. But the truth was smaller and better than that. A good man had been treated like a line item and still chose kindness. A powerful woman had been forced to look at the human cost of her own distance, and instead of turning away, she stepped closer. Sometimes that is all redemption is. Not thunder, not spectacle, just a door left open, a child breathing easier in the next room, and two people learning that respect can be the beginning of love when it arrives humbly enough. Ethan gave her a small nod as she reached her car, and Charlotte carried that image with her long after the headlights cut through the snow. A single father in a modest house, standing in a doorway with tired eyes and a steady heart, no longer waiting for the world to notice his worth because the people who mattered already had.